When thieves spot a blind farmer living alone with his horse on an isolated farm, they don't think twice about the easy target and plan to strike. But what the horse did left them speechless as they discovered something impossible. Hey there, animal lovers. If you're anything like us and you cherish all creatures great and small, hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss any heartwarming stories. Thanks. Now, back to our tale. The afternoon sun painted the sky above Willow Creek Ranch with shades of gold as Arthur strolled calmly across the porch of his farmhouse, his white cane tapping gently on the wooden floorboards. The sound of Shadow's hooves echoed from the nearby stable, a familiar rhythm that brought comfort to his heart. After so many years together, horse and owner had developed their own language, silent but eloquent. The property, nestled on a peaceful ranch just outside of town, had been his sanctuary for 5 years, ever since he'd decided to retire in search of tranquility. Mornings were filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the songs of the robins, while afternoons were dedicated to caring for Shadow and tending to the small apple orchard behind the house. But on this particular afternoon, something disturbed the usual stillness. Shadow was more restless than usual, his hooves thudding against the ground in an uneven pattern that Arthur knew well. It was a sign that something or someone unfamiliar was nearby. Years of experience had taught Arthur to trust his companion's instincts. "Easy, boy," Arthur murmured, his deep, calm voice cutting through the air. His calloused fingers found the silky mane of the animal, feeling the tension in the muscles beneath the black coat. "What are you sensing that I haven't noticed yet?" The wind carried fragments of a distant conversation, unfamiliar voices that didn't belong to the usual neighbors. Arthur strained his ears, an old skill he'd never lost, even after so many years away from active duty. The voices seemed to be coming from the main road, probably from a parked car. Mrs. Gable, his neighbor from the next ranch over, had mentioned over coffee that morning that strangers had been asking questions in town, people who didn't belong in the community, too interested in the ranch residents, especially the retirees living there. At the time, Arthur hadn't given the comment much thought, but now, a subtle sound of twigs snapping beyond the fence caught his attention. Cautious footsteps trying to go unnoticed. Shadow whinnied softly, a warning that only his owner could interpret. Arthur maintained his relaxed posture, continuing to stroke the horse's neck as if he hadn't noticed anything. "Let's go inside, partner," he said aloud, for the benefit of any listening ears. "It's almost time for your supper." His cane continued its rhythmic movement against the ground, the perfect image of a blind and helpless old man retreating for another quiet night. As he led Shadow back to the stable, his mind was already working, mapping out every inch of his property. He knew every dip in the terrain, every tree, every rock. Darkness had never been an obstacle for him. In fact, it was his oldest ally. The sun was beginning to set as Arthur closed the stable door, his sensitive fingers discreetly checking the reinforced locks he'd installed. Outside, the last golden rays cast long shadows across the yard, creating patterns he couldn't see but could feel in the change of the air temperature. Inside the house, seated in his favorite armchair with a mug of tea in his hands, Arthur waited. His ears picked up every sound, the chirping of the last birds returning to their nests, the rustling of leaves in the trees, and, yes, again those cautious footsteps, now closer. A discreet smile played on his lips as he took a sip of the tea. Whoever was watching his routine, planning what they imagined to be an easy robbery of a blind old man, was about to learn a valuable lesson about appearances. A few miles from Arthur's house, in the town's dive bar, 4 men spoke in hushed tones around a secluded table. The oldest of them, a gray-haired man named George, drummed his fingers nervously on the worn wooden tabletop. Rick, the leader of the group, stared at the glass in his hands with a calculating smile. The successful robbery of the Santos's house, an elderly couple from the same ranch, had yielded a good sum of money and jewelry, but something in his expression showed unease. "It's just a horse, Rick," scoffed Carl, the fourth member of the group. "What's it gonna do, kick us?" The low, mocking laughter was echoed by the others, except for Rick, who kept his serious expression. Back at Arthur's house, the night progressed silently. He remained seated in his armchair, his ears attentively capturing every variation in the environment. Years of training had taught him that darkness was more than the absence of light. It was a world rich in sounds and sensations that few knew how to interpret. The living room clock struck 10 with soft chimes. Arthur got up, moving with the confidence of someone who knows every inch of his territory. His steps were deliberately heavier than usual, creating the illusion of someone who needs to make noise to orient himself. "Always so careful," Mark teased, rolling his eyes. "It's just a blind old man. It'll be easier than taking candy from a baby." In the stable, Shadow remained restless. The black horse shifted in his stall, his hooves striking the ground in a code that only Arthur understood. The animal had sensed the presence of the observers long before his owner, and now shared his apprehension. A soft whinny was his reply, followed by a nudge that felt almost like a caress. The connection between the two went beyond the common understanding between man and animal. It was a partnership forged in circumstances that none of the observers could ever imagine. As he prepared for bed, Arthur mentally organized the terrain around his house. Every tree, every dip in the ground, every rock, everything could be useful in what was to come. His white cane rested beside his bed, seemingly harmless, but loaded with secrets that his future visitors would discover the hard way. Back in town, the four men said their goodbyes, each going his own way into the night. Rick cast one last glance in the direction of the ranch, an unsettling feeling still nagging at his thoughts. There was something about that blind old man's behavior that didn't fit the common pattern of their previous victims. The full moon illuminated the dirt road leading to Arthur's property, casting long shadows that danced with the night breeze. To untrained eyes, it was just another quiet night in Willow Creek Ranch. But for those who knew how to read the signs, like Arthur and Shadow, it was the calm before the storm. Day broke in Willow Creek Ranch with the usual routine. Arthur rose with the first rays of sunlight, as he had done every day since his days in the service. His experienced hands prepared breakfast with the precision of someone who doesn't need sight to navigate the kitchen. The local radio played softly, announcing another hot summer day. Among the local news, a comment caught his attention. Another robbery had occurred in the region, this time at the Santos's house. Arthur frowned, recalling the voices he'd heard the night before. In town, the four men gathered in an abandoned shack on the outskirts. Rick unfolded a rudimentary map of the ranch on a makeshift table, drawn after days of observation. Mark rolled his eyes, impatient. "We've already talked about this. It's just a blind old man with his horse. Why so much planning?" Meanwhile, Arthur carried out his morning routine with Shadow. To any observer, it would just be an elderly man caring for his pet. But there was a military precision to his movements, an economy of gestures that revealed years of training. Throughout the day, Arthur made small adjustments to his property. He moved some potted plants strategically, checked the hinges on the doors, made sure certain floorboards maintained their characteristic squeak. Each modification was subtle, imperceptible to untrained eyes. "Remember," Rick instructed at another meeting at dusk, "we go in at 2 in the morning. The old man usually turns in at 9. By then he'll be sound asleep." As the sun set, Arthur sat on his porch, seemingly enjoying the evening breeze. His cane rested beside him, and his fingers occasionally touched its handle with a familiarity that went beyond simple use as a guide. In the abandoned shack, the four men made the final preparations. Rick checked every detail of the plan one last time, while the others cleaned their tools. None of them realized they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. If you are enjoying the story, subscribe to our channel. Continuing. Miles away, on a dark curve of the rural road, 4 silhouettes moved like shadows around a parked car. Rick checked his watch for the 10th time, his restlessness growing with each minute. Because people notice strange cars more easily earlier in the evening, Rick replied, his tone revealing an experience that the others didn't possess. At 2 in the morning, even the neighborhood dogs will be asleep. Inside his seemingly silent house, Arthur moved with clockwork precision. His sensitive fingers checked every object, every position, making sure everything was exactly where it should be. The cane, his constant companion, rested near his bed, within immediate reach of his hands. In the stable, Shadow maintained his silent vigil. The black horse, whose past held as many secrets as his owners, occasionally twitched his ears, picking up sounds imperceptible to common human ears. His relaxed posture hid a readiness that few animals possessed. At midnight, the first moves began. Carl crept around the property, carrying a small bag with laced feed. His objective was to neutralize the horse before the main intrusion. With steps he believed were silent, he approached the stable. Inside the house, Arthur smiled in the dark. His trained ears picked up every movement, every held breath, every twig snapped under careless steps. Years of experience had taught him to construct a precise mental image using only sounds and vibrations. The full moon illuminated the grounds with an almost supernatural clarity, casting elongated shadows that seemed to dance with the night breeze. For the intruders, it was just another clear night that would facilitate their work. For Arthur, it was an ally that would reveal every movement of the intruders through the shadows moving beneath his door. Rick and the others waited in the darkness, watching Carl execute his part of the plan. George nervously checked his tools, while Mark could barely contain his anxiety. The silence of the night was broken only by the occasional hoot of a distant owl. "It's just an animal," snapped Mark, although his voice didn't carry the same conviction as before. "Stop being a scaredy cat." At 1:30 in the morning, Carl returned to the group, a satisfied smirk on his face. "Poisoned, feed in place. In half an hour, that horse will be sleeping like a baby." In the house, Arthur allowed an almost imperceptible smile to escape as he heard the whispered report from the criminals. His hands caressed the handle of the cane gently, feeling the small grooves that only he knew. The night was just beginning, and his unexpected visitors were about to discover that they had made a terrible mistake in their judgment. The clock struck 2 in the morning when the 4 men began their final approach. The moonlight created a play of shadows on the grounds, providing what they believed to be perfect cover for their movements. Rick led the group, his calculated steps demonstrating years of experience in nocturnal intrusions. Inside the house, Arthur remained lying in his bed, completely still. His trained ears picked up every exterior movement, the rustling of fabric against fabric, the muffled clinking of tools, controlled breathing. An almost imperceptible smile played on his lips as he built a mental map of each invader's position. Mark was the first to reach the back window. The one that his days of observation had indicated was the most vulnerable. His gloved hands worked at the old lock, practiced movements that normally guaranteed a silent entry. In the stable, Shadow remained standing, his muscles tense under his black coat. The horse, trained for situations far more complex than this, awaited the signal that only he would recognize. His watchful eyes followed every movement through the cracks in the wood. "Keep going," ordered Rick in an urgent whisper, pushing Mark inside. "We're already here, there's no turning back." George stumbled on something, causing a dull thud that made everyone freeze. Seconds dragged by as they waited for some sign that they had been discovered. The silence that followed seemed to confirm that luck was on their side. In the master bedroom, Arthur moved silently, his bare feet making no sound on the floor he knew so well. Years of training had taught him to move in the darkness as if it were his natural ally, which in fact it always had been. "Are you sure the old man's asleep?" whispered Mark, his previous confidence beginning to waver in the face of the oppressive silence of the house. In the living room, Rick stopped suddenly. Something in his criminal experience, a sixth sense developed over years, screamed that there was something fundamentally wrong with that situation. The organization of the house, the ease of entry, the silence of the horse. Everything seemed prepared, like a stage awaiting the start of a performance. It was at this moment that the first true sign that the night would not follow their plans manifested itself. A floorboard creaked, but not under the feet of any of the invaders. The sound came from a point in the house where none of them were. And then, as if it were a rehearsed signal, Shadow emitted a powerful whinny that cut through the silence of the night like a knife. Shadow's whinny provoked a moment of panic among the invaders. George almost dropped his flashlight, while Mark and Carl exchanged nervous glances in the darkness. Rick, however, remained still, his eyes trying to penetrate the shadows that seemed increasingly dense. Arthur's voice carried no fear or surprise, only a serenity that made the hairs on the back of the invaders' necks stand on end. It was the tone of someone who not only expected visitors, but had invited them into a trap. A soft sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, but when Mark pointed his flashlight in that direction, no one was there. The sound now seemed to come from another direction, then another, as if Arthur were in several places at once. "You've made 3 mistakes tonight," Arthur continued, his voice now seeming to come from behind Rick. "The first was choosing my house. The second was trying to drug my horse. And the third," a dramatic pause, "was believing that a blind man would be an easy target." George couldn't take it anymore. In a panic, he ran toward the window they had entered through. His feet found something on the floor, a strategically placed rope, and before he could scream, he was down, the air escaping from his lungs with the impact. The sound of Shadow's hooves changed, now more intense, more rhythmic. The floorboards began to creak in a sequence that seemed to respond to the horse, creating a disturbing symphony that filled the house. A low, controlled laugh echoed through the house. "In the dark?" asked Arthur, his voice now clearly amused. "Gentlemen, I live in the dark. It's my natural element. You, on the other hand, are just beginning to get acquainted with it." Rick tried to reorganize his men, but realized they were separated. The sounds of the house, the creaking of the floorboards, the whinnying of the horse, the mysterious echoes, had destroyed their carefully planned formation. Each man was now alone, lost in a labyrinth of shadows that seemed to take on a life of its own. "Amazing how fear can make the darkness so disorienting, isn't it?" commented Arthur, his voice now seeming to come from all corners of the house simultaneously. "You should have done your homework before choosing your target. You would have discovered that sometimes the limitations we see in others are actually their greatest strengths." Mark spun in circles, his flashlight cutting through the darkness in frantic movements. "Rick!" he called in a desperate whisper, but Rick didn't answer. He was too busy trying to understand how he had underestimated the situation so drastically. Rick pressed his back against the wall, trying to control his breathing. In 30 years of crime, he had never encountered a situation like this. The darkness, which had always been his ally, now seemed to work against him, dense and alive, as if responding to the old blind man's commands. A new sound echoed through the house, the soft tap-tap-tap of a cane against the floor. The sound came from all directions, and none of them impossible to locate. Mark, still wielding his shaky flashlight, spun in circles, increasingly frantic. The sound of Shadow's hooves changed again, now in a pattern reminiscent of a military march. Rick felt his blood run cold as he realized the implication of those words. War? Soldier? What kind of blind old man was this? "Fascinating how fear can paralyze even the bravest of men," commented Arthur, his voice now closer. "You came in here believing you would find a helpless old man. Instead, you found, well, something completely different." Rick tried to move, but realized he was completely disoriented. The house, which had seemed so simple during the planning, had transformed into a treacherous labyrinth. Every step could be a trap. Every shadow could hide its mysterious host. "Allow me to tell you a story," Arthur continued, his voice now coming from a fixed point, causing Rick to turn sharply. "Many years ago, there was a special unit of the army trained for nocturnal operations. They were known as the Night Phantoms. experts at moving in the darkness, at using shadows as camouflage. The most interesting thing about this unit, Arthur continued, was their horse training program. Animals specially selected and trained for nocturnal operations. Horses that could move in absolute silence when needed or create precise distractions when ordered. But the real secret, Arthur's voice was now just a few feet from Rick, was the bond between horse and rider. A partnership so deep that it transcended the need for verbal commands, a perfect harmony between man and animal. You know what happened to that unit, Rick? Arthur's voice was now directly behind him. They were never officially disbanded. Their members simply disappeared, found new purposes. Some, like me, chose quiet places to live, but they never lost their skills. Please, whispered Rick, his voice trembling for the first time in years. The veteran criminal, who had always prided himself on his self-control, felt like a child lost in the dark. Where are my men? A new sound filled the environment, the soft noise of ropes being manipulated, followed by metallic clicks that echoed through the house. Rick tried to move, but found that he was surrounded by an invisible web of obstacles. In the stable, Shadow began a new sequence of hoofbeats, softer now, almost musical. To Rick, it was as if the horse were marking the time of a performance coming to an end. Rick felt something brush against his arm, a rope, a wire. But when he tried to dodge it, he realized he had taken exactly the step that Arthur expected. In seconds, he was completely immobilized, his hands tied behind his back by knots that seemed to have formed from thin air. The night phantoms had a particular specialty, Arthur explained, now checking the bindings with experienced fingers. We were masters at creating illusions. Sound, movement, perception, everything could be manipulated to disorient the enemy. Shadow and I have perfected this art over the years. Outside, the moon continued its journey across the sky, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Rick was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Every detail they had observed during the planning, the predictable routine, the apparent vulnerability, even the ease of the invasion, had been carefully orchestrated. Your other partners are already in police custody, revealed Arthur, his voice now coming from near the window. They arrived a few minutes ago, silently. Another trick I learned. Timing is everything. You know, Rick, Arthur commented, adjusting his cane, you weren't the first to try to break into my house. Others have come before, drawn by the same illusion of vulnerability. But you were the most perceptive. You realized there was something wrong, even if you didn't know exactly what. The police will find enough evidence to connect your group to the other robberies in the area, Arthur continued, including the robbery at the Santos's house. But don't worry. No one needs to know that you were defeated by a blind old man and his horse. We can keep that part of our little encounter between us. The first rays of the sun began to gild the horizon when Sheriff Brody entered Arthur's property. The veteran lawman, a middle-aged man with graying hair at the temples, stopped abruptly when he saw the scene before him. 4 men detained, each perfectly immobilized, and a blind old man standing next to a majestic black horse. "Colonel Arthur," said the sheriff, raising his hand to his forehead in an instinctive military salute. "I should have figured it was you when I got the call about an unusual situation on the ranch." "John Brody," replied Arthur with a warm smile, recognizing the sheriff's voice. "Long time, old friend, since that mission back in '92, isn't it?" The younger officers watched the scene with a mixture of confusion and admiration as they led the detained criminals to the patrol cars. The way the sheriff treated Arthur and Shadow suggested a history much deeper than any of them could imagine. Brody nodded, making notes in his notebook, and I imagine they made the mistake of underestimating a certain retired colonel and his warhorse. While the officers collected evidence and finished processing the scene, Brody pulled Arthur aside. "You could have asked for protection, you know. After the first robberies on the ranch, we could have stationed a patrol car." The black horse whinnied softly, as if agreeing with his owner's statement. Brody couldn't contain a laugh. "Some may retire from service," he commented, But the service never really leaves us, does it? You know, continued Brody, watching his men work, the rookies at the station aren't going to believe it when I tell them that a blind old man and his horse captured an entire gang without spilling a drop of blood. The next morning, Willow Creek Ranch was abuzz with speculation. The news of the arrest of the gang that had been terrorizing the area spread quickly, but the details remained hazy. Some residents swore they had seen strange lights during the night on Arthur's property. Others claimed to have heard mysterious sounds coming from the ranch. Mrs. Gable, Arthur's nearest neighbor, watched from her porch as a constant stream of curious onlookers passed by on the dirt road, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the property where the previous night's events had unfolded. Arthur smiled, savoring the coffee prepared by his neighbor. Shadow grazed peacefully in the field next door, as if the previous night had been nothing more than a dream. Across the road, a group of children watched Shadow with renewed admiration. The black horse, who had previously seemed like just an exceptional pet, now took on an air of legend in the eyes of the community. Arthur tilted his head slightly, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by his observant neighbor. Your husband was a wise man, Martha, and he was right. The best stories are the ones that don't need to be told aloud. It's strange, commented Mr. Santos, sitting next to Arthur on the porch. When we were robbed, I felt so powerless. And here you are, who everyone considered more vulnerable than us, protecting the entire community. In the afternoon, Father O'Malley, a respected figure in the community, paid his visit. The clergyman, known for his perspicacity, observed Arthur with a knowing look. Arthur smiled, turning his face in the direction of the breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers. Sometimes, Father, it's the simplest places that offer the most significant challenges, and the most important victories are the ones that no one needs to applaud. As dusk approached, the activity around Arthur's property finally began to diminish. The sky was tinged with orange hues when Sheriff Brody returned, this time alone and off duty. He found Arthur in the stable, carefully brushing Shadow's coat. Arthur continued his methodical work with the brush, a small smile playing on his lips. Fear has that effect on people, John. When deprived of sight, the mind fills in the gaps with its own terrors. Sometimes, replied Arthur, his hand finding a specific spot on Shadow's neck that made the horse whinny softly. The most valuable lesson we can teach is to show people that the world is much bigger than they imagine. Arthur stopped his work for a moment, his expression becoming more serious. Violence is the recourse of those who lack imagination, John. Our unit was different precisely because of that. We weren't just soldiers. We were guardians of something greater. The Night Phantoms, murmured Brody, the name still carrying a special weight even after so many years. You know, some of the younger officers started researching the unit after hearing our conversation earlier today. They didn't find anything, of course. Outside the stable, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grounds. Brody watched as the shadows seemed to dance with the wind, remembering nights of operation where those same shadows were his most reliable allies. Let them speculate, replied Arthur with a serene smile. Sometimes a little mystery is good for a community, gives people something to think about besides their daily routines. At the Willow Creek Ranch Sheriff's Station, Rick remained seated in his cell, watching the shadows that dusk cast through the bars. Something had fundamentally changed within him after the events of the night before. The experienced criminal, who had always prided himself on his control and meticulous planning, now found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the world. He wants to talk to you, said Brody to Arthur, who had agreed to make one last visit to the station. He hasn't stopped insisting since he found out you were coming. Colonel, called Rick as soon as he heard the approaching footsteps. His voice, once so confident, now carried a tone of reverence and something else, regret perhaps. Arthur rested both hands on his cane, a gesture vaguely reminiscent of a teacher about to give an important lesson. Sometimes, Rick, the best way to teach a lesson is to allow the student to reach the end of his mistake. For the community, yes, agreed Arthur, but mainly for yourselves. Each man carries his own demons, Rick. Yours led you to underestimate others, to see weakness where there is strength. Now, replied Arthur, you have a choice. You can carry this experience as a humiliation, or you can learn from it. The darkness that frightened you so much last night, it doesn't only exist out there, Rick. It's inside each of us. The difference is how we choose to deal with it. A week had passed since the events of that memorable night. Willow Creek Ranch gradually returned to its usual routine, although something had subtly changed in the small community. The ranch residents walked with more confidence, and the stories about the miracle at the blind man's house continued to circulate, growing with each new version. On a particularly pleasant afternoon, Arthur received an unexpected visitor. Captain Reynolds, his former commander in the Night Phantoms, had made a long journey after hearing about the recent happenings. Arthur smiled, pouring coffee for his former superior. You taught me well, Captain. True victory isn't in defeating the enemy, but in transforming him. They see themselves differently, corrected Arthur gently. They've realized that appearances can be deceiving, that strength doesn't always come from where we expect. I heard you're going to start giving riding lessons to the ranch kids, commented Reynolds, watching a group of youngsters pass by on the road, waving excitedly at Arthur. Captain Reynolds nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of his former subordinate's words. The Night Phantoms may have been officially disbanded, but their spirit lives on through men like you, Arthur. In the distance, the sound of hooves on gravel announced the arrival of more visitors, likely the first students for the riding lessons. Shadow raised his head, his ears twitching with interest, already assuming his new role as a teacher. Autumn arrived at Willow Creek Ranch, bringing with it winds of change. The ranch, once known only as a peaceful retreat for retirees, had transformed into a place of whispered stories and silent lessons. On Sunday afternoons, it became common to see groups of children gathered in Arthur's field, their cheerful voices mingling with Shadow's soft whinnies. The secret is to trust, explained Arthur to a young student who hesitated to mount. Shadow knows when you're afraid, when you're confident, when you're happy. Horses are like life. They respond to what we have inside us, not what we show on the outside. Mrs. Gable, who now served coffee and cookies to the parents waiting during the lessons, smiled as she watched the transformation. The man, whom many had considered a vulnerable old man, had revealed himself to be one of the strongest pillars of the community. At the sheriff's station, things had also changed. Rick and his companions, serving their sentences, had become a different kind of example. Sheriff Brody occasionally received letters from Rick, each revealing a man in the process of profound transformation. On a particularly clear morning, Arthur was on his porch when he heard familiar footsteps approaching. It was Father O'Malley, bringing news from town. Arthur smiled, his fingers drumming gently on the arm of the chair. It's not my story, Father. It's the story of Willow Creek Ranch, of how a community discovered that its greatest strength lay precisely in those who seemed weakest. You know, continued Arthur, his voice carrying that serenity that had become his trademark, when I retired from the Night Phantoms, I thought I was retiring from service, but now I understand that I've only changed missions. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight, not with strength, but with wisdom and compassion. The gentle wind carried the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of children's laughter. Willow Creek Ranch had changed, yes, but for the better. The shadows that once brought fear now carried stories of courage and overcoming adversity. And so, beneath the blue sky of Willow Creek Ranch, an old blind colonel, his faithful warhorse, and a transformed community continued to write their story. A story of courage, wisdom, and the extraordinary strength that can be found in the most unexpected places.